What's good? It's Woog. I want to talk some Rolling Stones, but specifically, my question is, why is Rocks Off not played nearly as much as, the famous Rolling Stones singles and songs that you can still hear on oldies radio, classic rock radio, and so forth. And Rocks Off is the opening song to arguably their most critically acclaimed and celebrated album, Exile on Main Street. So Exile on Main Street was kind of like the last of this series of classic albums that the Rolling Stones had. They had their early to mid 60s career where they had the songs like the classic Satisfaction, their epic breakthrough, right? That's like if it was the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Satisfaction is one of the greatest or at least most famous rock songs ever. So they had that early part of their career, and then they had other, big singles over the next couple of years like Painted Black, Under My Thumb. But then after their 1967 album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, that was kind of if you look at the album cover, you could tell that it was kind of like a response to, the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and that they were kind of getting into their psychedelic themes, Rolling Stones were. But then they went on this run from 1968, and then it led to Exile on Main Street 1972. And that run included Beggar's Banquet. That was the album with Sympathy for the Devil and Street Fighting Man. And then they got to Let It Bleed. That's the one with Gimme Shelter. Love that song. And then they got to Sticky Fingers, and that's the one with Brown Sugar and Wild Horses. And then it was after that when the Rolling Stones members moved to France, basically to escape their tax troubles in their hometown. So they moved to France and they are recording this new album, and it's a lot more unhinged than those other albums on that, classic album run, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers. This one is a lot more unhinged. So they moved to France, they record at Villa Nellcote. This is a mansion that's kind of famously associated with the Rolling Stones recording Exile on Main Street. So they do the bulk of the recording in these sessions at Villa Nellcote in France, and they are kind of, flaking on a lot of the sessions. In a lot of the sessions, Mick Jagger wasn't there. He had recently gotten married, and then Keith Richards was well into his heroin addiction. And there were others doing the heroin with him, like Mick Taylor, and then even the sound engineer and some of the session musicians that were coming in and playing. So, half of the Rolling Stones is, dealing with a lot of heroin at the time. Mick Jagger wasn't really indulging as much in the heroin, but it was kind of spotty in terms of who would be showing up to some of these sessions. But in these sessions, they recorded Rocks Off as well as several other songs that ended up on this double album. This is a super long album, Exile on Main Street. And then after they did the rough recordings at Villa Nellcote, which, Keith Richards is the one who rented that out in the summer of 1971. So they did the recordings there, and then they brought it to Sunset Sound, the studio in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, California. That place is still there, by the way. You could drive right by it. But they basically picked up on the remaining recordings where they had more session musicians basically layer accompanying vocals, and then Mick Jagger was basically leading a lot of these sessions. Again, he was absent in a lot of the earlier sessions in France, but he was leading a lot of these sessions in Los Angeles where they kind of touched up, and they did a lot of the mixing and mastering and basically a lot of the overdubs and stuff on the songs that would shape into Exile on Main Street. And on that album, which again, this is probably the Rolling Stones' most celebrated album in their entire discography. It's definitely up there. I mean, if you look at the Rolling Stone greatest rock and roll albums of all time, usually Exile on Main Street on these lists will be the highest ranking Rolling Stones album. And track one from that album is Rocks Off. And with the opening guitar, and it's Keith Richards. He to me is one of the greatest rock and roll songwriters of all time. I know a lot of people usually mention Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, Brian May from Queen. There are a lot of other rock guitarists that get mentioned sometimes before Keith Richards. Sometimes even like David Gilmour of Pink Floyd will be mentioned before Keith Richards. But when you look at Keith Richards' track record and his, his blues and country, those early influences that shaped his songwriting styles and kind of made him like a rock and roll riff master. Not to mention, he did more songwriting in a lot of the Rolling Stones discography than like Mick Jagger did. I know Mick Jagger was the vocalist, but Keith Richards was like the songwriting backbone of the band. And I know Brian Jones and a lot of the early stuff had a major part in the instrumentation, arrangements, songwriting. And, Brian Jones was as like integral to the band as anybody. But when we get to this point of their career, Keith Richards is on absolute fire. And again, there is no better way to kick this album off than with Rocks Off. And Rocks Off is arguably my favorite song on the album. And this album also includes Tommy Tumblin' Dice, Sweet Virginia, Rip This Joint, Sweet Black Angel, the single Happy. Like, this album is stacked, and Rocks Off might be the best rocker on it. And it sounds unhinged. Like, it sounds like it's not perfectly mixed. Like, Mick Jagger, he's not one of these like lead singers who's gonna be able to compete with like a Roger Daltrey from The Who, or like a Don Henley from the Eagles. He doesn't have like a beautiful voice. Like, you listen to even how he sings, Wild Horses. It's not like a great singing voice. Like, if he was auditioning for American Idol, he might not make it to Hollywood. You know what I mean? But his thin voice, he's able to make it work for him because of how kind of scratchy it sounds like on certain tracks. It just sounds a little bit disheveled. And where he's, kind of coming in vocally on Rocks Off, it's largely about injecting something intravenously and then feeling the euphoria of that high, basically. That's what Rocks Off is alluding to in a lot of the song lyrics. And even how you could hear him say, I hear you walking when I'm on the street. He just sounds like he's going through it, And so Mick Jagger, like his vocal performance, no, it's not one of those classically sung songs. Like he's not, Robert Plant on Since I've Been Loving You, one of the greatest, rock and roll vocal performances that you'll ever find. That was on Led Zeppelin's third album, Since I've Been Loving You. But Mick Jagger makes his vocal qualities work. And Rocks Off is a perfect example of that. And I'm just wondering, why are we not hearing this song like damn near all the time? It's not like it's hidden or anything. Like, what's that song on the Rolling Stones, 1981 album, Tattoo You? Called Heaven. Like, it's a very dream poppy song, like very unlike most of Rolling Stones' other music. Like, if you were to hear the song, if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't think that was a Rolling Stones song. But it's called Heaven. It's on a 1981 album, so it's like 2 decades into their career. So if that one slipped through the cracks and you don't hear it often, I could understand that. But Rocks Off, again, kicks off their most acclaimed album. It's track 1, so it's not like it's like buried deep into like an album. So I just wonder, why isn't this up there with Happy or Ruby Tuesday or It's Only Rock and Roll But I Like It, or just the countless other Rolling Stones songs? Miss You, right? There are tons of other songs that Rocks Off, to me, is superior than, but you almost never hear Rocks Off unless you're actually listening to the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street album. And it's just baffling to me. They even have like the horn sections, like, halfway into the song. And it just sounds like just one of those like thigh slappers where, by the time they're just taking off and, Mick Jagger's like, Rocks Off, and he's just, going into his thing, the band is just clicking on all cylinders. It sounds like there's so much going on, but it's not like a Phil Spector wall of sound. Like, you could hear the brass separated from the guitars, from the bass. And, it might not be perfectly mixed, but it sounds like an all-out rocker party. Just sounds like it embodies what the rock and roll spirit is, which was very much what the Rolling Stones were trying to embody with this, kind of almost like a country western. Like, there's a lot of country on Exile on Main Street. Like, just listen to Sweet Virginia. That sounds as country as anything. There's a lot of blues. There's a lot of just roots rock. There's a lot of gospel influences around that time for Rolling Stones. So yeah, Rocks Off, again, kicks off the greatest, we could call it maybe the greatest Rolling Stones album ever, but it's almost nowhere to be found on any classic rock radio. And that's just a little bit baffling to me. But yeah, let me know if you are familiar with the song that is Rocks Off. And if you have any idea as to why it doesn't get the same burn as the other Rolling Stones classics, let me know what you think about it in the comments. And do you like Rocks Off as much as I do? If not, give me like your 5 favorite Rolling Stones songs. And if you are that into, for instance, Exile on Main Street, let me know what other songs you like from that album more than Rocks Off. Because again, I think that it might be the strongest song on the album, and it's track 1. But it never is heard to, like a larger audience. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.